Welcome, weary wanderers of the night, to the shadowed halls of power that have governed the Jujutsu world for over a millennium. Tonight, we delve into the ancient bloodlines that shaped destiny itself, the three great families whose names echo through corridors of supernatural politics and whose inherited techniques have determined the fate of nations. This is the story of the Gojo, Zenin, and Kamo clans, their rise to prominence, their bitter rivalries, and the way their influence shaped every aspect of the hidden world that protects humanity from cursed spirits. Close your eyes and let us guide you through centuries of power, tradition, and the heavy weight of inherited greatness. In the shadowed mists of the Heian period, when demons walked openly among mortals, and the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was gossamer thin, the foundations of what would become the three great families were laid not through grand design, but through necessity, born of survival. This was an age when cursed spirits manifested with such frequency and malevolence that entire villages could vanish in a single night, consumed by entities that fed on human fear and despair with insatiable hunger that grew stronger with each soul they claimed. The land that would one day be called Japan existed in a state of constant supernatural warfare, where the distinction between protector and predator was often determined not by noble intention, but by the simple question of which side of the conflict offered better chances of seeing another sunrise. In this primordial chaos, certain individuals began to emerge, whose abilities transcended the desperate hedge magic and folk remedies that most humans employed against the darkness that surrounded them on all sides. The earliest ancestors of what would become the Gojo, Zenin, and Kamo families were not yet organized into the sophisticated political entities they would eventually become, but rather loose collections of gifted individuals who recognized that their unique talents for manipulating cursed energy could be enhanced through cooperation and the sharing of knowledge that had been accumulated through generations of trial and error. These proto-clans formed around specific techniques that had proven particularly effective against the supernatural threats that plagued human settlements with relentless consistency. The technique that would eventually be known as Limitless emerged from practitioners who understood that the fundamental nature of space itself could be manipulated through precise application of cursed energy, guided by mathematical principles that existed at the intersection of observable physics and metaphysical possibility. These early masters discovered that distance, which appeared to be fixed and immutable, was actually fluid and subject to conscious manipulation by individuals whose perception and will were sufficiently refined to grasp concepts that challenged ordinary understanding of reality's basic structure. The blood manipulation technique developed among healers and warriors who recognized that the essence of life itself flowed through patterns that could be directed and controlled, that the crimson river that sustained all living things was not merely biological function, but a form of cursed energy so fundamental that mastering its manipulation provided access to powers that seemed to violate natural law while actually operating according to deeper principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and physical form. The 10 Shadows technique emerged from those who understood that the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of spirits was permeable to individuals who possessed sufficient knowledge and will to form contracts with entities that existed in the spaces between conventional reality and the vast unknown that lay beyond human comprehension. These shadow walkers learned to summon beings that were neither fully cursed spirit nor entirely benevolent, creatures that existed in states of neutral service to masters, who could demonstrate the strength and wisdom necessary to command their respect. The political structure that would eventually govern Jujutsu society began to take shape as these early practitioners recognized that individual strength, regardless of its magnitude, was insufficient to address threats that required coordinated response and strategic thinking that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns toward long-term planning for the survival of human civilization itself. The informal alliances that developed during this period were based on mutual recognition that cooperation provided advantages that could not be achieved through individual effort alone, regardless of personal capabilities or inherited talents. The territorial divisions that characterized later family influence began as practical necessities rather than political ambitions, with different groups of practitioners taking responsibility for protecting specific regions based on their proximity to established settlements and their understanding of local supernatural threats that required specialized knowledge to address effectively. These early spheres of influence were determined more by geographic convenience and tactical effectiveness than by abstract concepts of inherited authority or political dominance over other human beings. The transition from loose cooperative agreements to formal clan structure occurred gradually over several centuries as successful techniques were passed down through family lines and the advantages of inherited knowledge became apparent to be practitioners who understood that mastery of complex cursed energy manipulation required decades of study that could be accelerated through access to accumulated wisdom and training methods that had been refined through generations of practical application under combat conditions. The establishment of hereditary leadership within these emerging families reflected the practical recognition that individuals who possessed both inherited talent and comprehensive training in family techniques were generally better equipped to make strategic decisions that affected not just immediate tactical situations, but long-term survival prospects for all family members and their associated communities. This evolution toward hereditary authority was not based on abstract principles of noble blood or divine right, but on empirical observation that preparation beginning in early childhood produced more capable leaders than selection based on adult achievement alone. The early relationships between the three proto-families were characterized by cautious cooperation, tempered by competitive awareness that each group's innovations and discoveries represented potential advantages that could shift the balance of power in future conflicts with supernatural threats or rival human factions. This dynamic created incentives for both collaboration and secrecy that would define inter-family politics for centuries, as each clan recognized the value of shared knowledge while understanding the risks that came with revealing their most effective techniques to potential competitors. The survival of these family structures through the massive social and political changes that transformed ancient Japan into a modern nation required adaptations that tested their fundamental identity while preserving the essential characteristics that made them effective as supernatural protection forces. The families learned to maintain their traditional roles and techniques while adapting to new technologies, political systems, and social structures that often conflicted with their historical methods of operation, but could not be ignored without risking irrelevance or elimination by forces they were unprepared to address through conventional means. The development of formal relationships with emerging governmental structures required the families to balance their traditional autonomy with the practical necessities of operating within legal and political frameworks that were designed by people who had no understanding of supernatural threats or the specialized requirements for addressing them effectively. This integration process involved compromises and accommodations that sometimes conflicted with family traditions, but were necessary for maintaining their ability to fulfill their protective functions in a world that was becoming increasingly complex and interconnected. The establishment of the Jujutsu Society as a formal institution, separate from but connected to the family structure, represented recognition that the growing complexity of supernatural threats and the expanding scope of required responses demanded organizational capabilities that exceeded what even the most sophisticated family-based systems could provide independently. This institutionalization process preserved family autonomy in areas of traditional expertise while creating mechanisms for coordination and resource sharing that enhanced overall effectiveness, without completely subsuming individual clan identity into bureaucratic homogenization. The ancient foundations that were established during this formative period created patterns of operation and relationship that would persist for over 1,000 years, shaping how the three great families understood their roles, their obligations to each other and to human society, and the proper balance between tradition and adaptation that would enable them to survive and flourish despite the constant pressure of changing circumstances and evolving threats that required continuous innovation within frameworks of inherited wisdom that had proven their value through centuries of practical application under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Among the three great families, none has embodied the concept of absolute power concentrated in singular brilliance, quite like the Gojo clan, whose history reads like a testament to the terrifying beauty of techniques so profound that their mastery approaches divine authority over the fundamental forces that govern physical reality. The limitless technique that defines their legacy is not merely an inherited ability, but a mathematical poem written in the language of space and time, a cursed technique so complex that its theoretical foundations challenge the greatest minds, while its practical applications have shaped the course of Jujutsu history through demonstrations of power that transcend normal categories of power, strength and weakness. The origins of the Gojo family can be traced back to the early Heian period, when the first practitioners of spatial manipulation emerged from among those rare individuals whose perception of reality was not constrained by the conventional understanding of distance and proximity that governed ordinary human experience. These ancestral masters discovered that space itself was not the fixed framework that it appeared to be, but rather a fluid medium that could be shaped and controlled through precise application of cursed energy guided by mathematical principles that existed at the intersection of theoretical, physics, and metaphysical possibility. The limitless technique in its most basic form operates on the premise that infinity can be brought into finite space, creating barriers and effects that utilize the fundamental impossibility of traversing infinite distance within finite time. The early Gojo practitioners who developed this ability understood intuitively that what appeared to be empty space was actually filled with infinite subdivision, that any distance could be broken down into smaller and smaller segments that never reached zero, but approached it asymptotically, creating practical impossibilities within apparent possibilities. The mathematical elegance of the limitless technique requires computational abilities that exceed normal human cognitive capacity, demanding practitioners who can process multiple complex equations simultaneously while maintaining perfect awareness of spatial relationships that exist on scales ranging from cosmic to subatomic. The early development of this technique was therefore limited to individuals whose minds could grasp and manipulate concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed ordinary consciousness and perception. The Six Eyes represent the second component of the Gojo family's legendary power, a mutation so rare that it appears perhaps once in a generation and provides its bearer with supernatural perception that transcends normal categories of visual and cognitive processing. Those blessed or cursed with the Six Eyes possess the ability to perceive cursed energy in all its manifestations with perfect clarity, seeing not just the presence and movement of supernatural forces, but understanding their mathematical relationships and theoretical foundations with intuitive comprehension that would take ordinary scholars' lifetimes to achieve through study and contemplation. The combination of the limitless technique and the six eyes creates a synergy that has appeared only a handful of times throughout the Gojo family's millennium-long history, each occurrence marking a pivotal moment in Jujutsu society's development and the broader balance of power that governs the relationship between human civilization and the supernatural forces that constantly threaten its existence. The rarity of this combination makes each bearer a figure of both hope and terror, someone whose capabilities approach theoretical perfection, while their human limitations create vulnerabilities that enemies constantly seek to exploit. The most legendary example of this combination's power manifested during the early Edo period, when a Gojo family head who possessed both inherited gifts engaged in a conflict with the Zenin clan that culminated in the most devastating display of spatial manipulation techniques that had ever been witnessed by human observers. The battle between the Gojo master and the Zenin head who commanded the full power of the Ten Shadows technique was fought across multiple locations over several days, with each combatant pushing their respective abilities beyond every previously established limit in pursuit of decisive victory. The Gojo practitioner's approach to this legendary battle demonstrated the terrifying potential that lay dormant within the limitless technique when wielded by someone whose six eyes provided perfect understanding of spatial relationships combined with computational abilities that could process multiple complex techniques simultaneously. His deployment of the hollow technique, that would later be known as purple, represented innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was considered theoretically possible, combining the attractive force of blue with the repulsive force of red to create effects that approached pure annihilation of matter and energy. The Zenin family head who faced this overwhelming display of power was no ordinary opponent, but a master of the Ten Shadows technique, whose understanding of his inherited abilities had reached levels that enabled him to summon and coordinate multiple Shikigami simultaneously, while maintaining perfect tactical awareness of battlefield conditions that were constantly changing due to his opponent's spatial manipulations. The adaptive capabilities of Mahoraga, the most powerful of the Ten Shadows Shikigami, provided him with defensive options that could theoretically counter even the most sophisticated applications of the limitless technique. The mutual destruction that concluded this legendary battle served as both demonstration of ultimate technique mastery and cautionary tale about the costs that accompanied the pursuit of absolute power without regard for consequences that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. Both masters pushed their inherited abilities so far beyond sustainable limits that their bodies could not survive the energies they had channeled, dying at the moment of their greatest triumph, while their techniques continued to operate with autonomous precision that reshaped the battlefield long after their consciousness had departed. The aftermath of this conflict established patterns of relationship between the Gojo and Zenin families that would persist for centuries. Mutual respect, tempered by awareness that future conflicts between clan heads who achieved similar levels of mastery might result in catastrophic damage that extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect innocent civilians and the broader stability of Jujutsu society itself. The legendary battle became a reference point for strategic planning and technique development, a reminder that some victories carried costs that made them indistinguishable from defeats. The intervening centuries between this legendary conflict and the birth of Satoru Gojo were marked by the gradual evolution of limitless technique applications, as successive family heads developed new approaches to spatial manipulation while struggling with the fundamental challenge that the six eyes mutation appeared with such rarity that most Gojo practitioners had to rely on inferior perception and computational abilities that limited their access to the technique's full potential. This period saw the development of various workarounds and alternative approaches that maximized effectiveness despite the absence of perfect synergy. The political position of the Gojo family throughout this historical period was unique among the three great families due to their reliance on individual brilliance rather than collective strength, creating circumstances where their influence within Jujutsu society fluctuated dramatically based on the capabilities of whoever currently served as clan head. During periods when the family head possessed exceptional abilities, their voice in political matters carried weight that exceeded their numerical representation, while leadership transitions often resulted in temporary weakness that rivals attempted to exploit through various forms of pressure and manipulation. The isolation that characterized the Gojo family's approach to clan management reflected practical necessities that arose from the extreme rarity of individuals capable of mastering the limitless technique to any significant degree, combined with the security requirements that surrounded anyone who possessed the six eyes and therefore represented a strategic asset whose loss would fundamentally alter the balance of power within Jujutsu society. This isolation was both protective measure and tragic necessity, preserving the family's most valuable members while limiting their exposure to the normal social interactions that characterized human development and relationship formation. The mystery surrounding other Gojo family members and their apparent absence from contemporary Jujutsu society reflects the clan's historical tendency toward extreme privacy regarding their internal affairs, combined with practical security measures that protected potential Six Eyes bearers from the constant assassination attempts that had characterized every previous generation. The family's approach to maintaining bloodline purity, while avoiding the inbreeding problems that affected other ancient clans, required careful management of marriages and alliances that remained hidden from public observation and potential enemy intelligence gathering. The birth of Satoru Gojo on December 7th, 1989, represented the culmination of centuries of careful genetic preservation and the manifestation of potential that had remained dormant within the family bloodline since the legendary master who had died fighting the Zenin clan head generations earlier. The appearance of both the limitless technique and the six eyes in a single individual marked the end of an extended period of relative weakness and the beginning of an era when the Gojo family would achieve unprecedented influence within Jujutsu society through the overwhelming capabilities of their youngest member. The immediate response to Satoru's birth from rival families and external threats demonstrated how thoroughly the Jujutsu world understood the implications of his existence for existing power balances and strategic calculations that had remained stable for generations. The assassination attempts that began when he was still an infant reflected not personal animosity, but cold strategic assessment that eliminating him before his abilities could develop represented the last opportunity to prevent a fundamental shift in how power was distributed within their hidden society. The transformation of the Gojo family from influential but not dominant political player into the most powerful force within Jujutsu society occurred gradually as Satoru's abilities developed and his approach to using his inherited techniques began to reshape how other practitioners understood the possibilities and limitations of cursed energy manipulation. His innovations in limitless technique application pushed the boundaries of what previous masters had considered theoretically possible, while his integration of the six eyes with spatial manipulation achieved synergy that exceeded even the legendary practitioners whose exploits had defined family history. The unique position that Satoru's overwhelming individual capabilities created for the Gojo family within the political structure of Jujutsu society represented both unprecedented opportunity and fundamental challenge to traditional methods of maintaining influence through collective action and strategic alliance building. His ability to achieve objectives through direct application of superior force reduced the family's dependence on political maneuvering while simultaneously isolating them from the coalition-building activities that had historically provided smaller clans with methods for amplifying their influence beyond their individual capabilities. The philosophical implications of Satoru's approach to family leadership and his relationship with inherited tradition reflected broader questions about the role of individual excellence within systems designed around collective decision-making and shared responsibility for outcomes that affected entire community. His willingness to operate independently of family consensus and traditional protocols created effectiveness in achieving immediate objectives while raising concerns about the long-term sustainability of approaches that depended entirely on singular capabilities rather than institutional strength that could survive leadership transitions. The educational innovations that Satoru introduced during his tenure as an instructor at Tokyo Jujutsu High represented attempts to address the systemic problems that had prevented previous generations from achieving their full potential, while avoiding the isolation and psychological damage that had characterized his own development within a family structure designed around protecting exceptional individuals rather than nurturing their complete human development. His teaching methods reflected understanding that technical mastery, without emotional wisdom, created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit regardless of raw power levels. The legacy that Satoru Gojo created for his family transcends the specific techniques and political achievements that characterized his active career, representing instead a fundamental redefinition of what it means to inherit power and the responsibilities that accompany exceptional gifts within systems that depend on supernatural abilities for their continued existence. His example demonstrated that individual strength could be used to nurture collective capability rather than simply dominating through superior force, creating possibilities for future generations that had not existed within traditional approaches to family leadership and technique development. The mystery that surrounds the future of the Gojo family following Satoru's death reflects the unprecedented nature of his contributions and the uncertainty about whether the clan can maintain its influence without the overwhelming individual capabilities that had defined their position within Jujutsu society for the final decades of the traditional order. The techniques and innovations that he developed represent legacy that extends beyond family boundaries toward the broader evolution of how cursed energy can be understood and utilized by future generations of practitioners who may not share his bloodline but can benefit from the theoretical frameworks that his work established. The Zenin family stands as perhaps the most complex and contradictory of the three great families, a clan whose thousand-year history encompasses both the highest expressions of Jujutsu excellence and the most troubling examples of how inherited power can corrupt the very values it claims to preserve. Their story is one of shadows within shadows, where the literal darkness manipulated by their signature technique serves as metaphor for the moral ambiguity that has characterized their approach to maintaining influence within a society that demands both strength and wisdom from those who would claim leadership over others. The origins of the Zenin clan can be traced to the earliest periods of organized Jujutsu practice, when the first Shadow Walkers discovered that the boundary between the physical world and the realm of spirits was more permeable than most humans understood, that consciousness sufficiently trained and disciplined could reach across dimensional barriers to form contracts with entities that existed in states of neither complete mortality nor absolute transcendence. These ancestral masters learned to navigate the dangerous territories that lay between conventional reality and the vast unknown, developing techniques that allowed them to summon and command beings whose power derived from their existence outside normal categories of life and death. The 10 Shadows technique that became the clan's most celebrated inheritance represents one of the most sophisticated approaches to spirit manipulation ever developed within Jujutsu practice, requiring practitioners to understand not only the theoretical principles that governed interdimensional communication, but also the complex psychological and spiritual requirements for maintaining control over entities that possessed their own consciousness and motivations. The technique's power lay not in simple domination, but in the creation of mutually beneficial relationships between human sorcerer and shadow spirit, contracts that provided access to extraordinary abilities, while demanding constant vigilance to prevent the summoned beings from overwhelming their supposed masters. The 10 distinct Shikigami that could be summoned through mastery of this technique each represented different aspects of power and capability that reflected the comprehensive nature of the Zenin approach to supernatural combat, problem solving. Divine dogs provided tracking and reconnaissance capabilities that exceeded anything achievable through normal means, while New offered mobility and aerial surveillance that transformed tactical possibilities for practitioners who understood how to coordinate ground-based and airborne operations. The Great Serpent delivered overwhelming physical force that could break through defensive barriers that would stop conventional attacks, while Toad provided support capabilities that enhanced the effectiveness of other techniques and strategies. The progression system that governed access to more powerful Shikigami reflected the Zenin understanding that true mastery required gradual development of both technical skill and psychological resilience necessary to maintain control over increasingly dangerous and independent entities. Max Elephant represented the transition point between manageable summons and beings whose power could pose risks to their summoners if not handled with perfect discipline and understanding. Rabbit Escape demonstrated the clan's appreciation for tactical flexibility and the importance of techniques that provided options rather than simply overwhelming force. The Round Deer and its reverse curse technique applications showed how the Zenin had integrated healing and support capabilities into what might otherwise have been purely combat-focused inheritance, understanding that sustainable operations required practitioners who could maintain themselves and their allies through extended conflicts that tested endurance as much as raw power. Piercing Ox provided armor-breaking capabilities that could overcome defensive techniques that might otherwise neutralize conventional attacks, while Agito represented the clan's mastery of technique fusion that allowed creative combinations impossible through individual Shikigami deployment. But it was Mahoraga, the Divine General, that represented the ultimate expression of 10 Shadows mastery, and the reason why the technique was considered equal to the Gojo family's Limitless in terms of potential for reshaping the fundamental balance of power within Jujutsu society. This final Shikigami possessed adaptive capabilities that approached theoretical perfection, the ability to analyze and develop counters for any attack or technique encountered during combat, making it potentially capable of overcoming even the most overwhelming displays of individual power through patient observation and systematic adaptation. The historical significance of Mahoraga was demonstrated most dramatically during the legendary battle between the Zenin clan head and the Gojo master that ended in mutual destruction, when the Divine General's adaptive abilities proved sufficient to counter even the most sophisticated applications of spatial manipulation, while providing its summoner with defensive options that allowed him to survive long enough to posend. achieve tactical parity with an opponent whose raw power should have made victory impossible. The cost of this achievement was the summoner's life, but the demonstration established the Ten Shadows technique as comparable to any inheritance within the Jujutsu world. The development of projection sorcery as a secondary inherited technique within the Zenin clan reflected the family's commitment to innovation and adaptation that complemented their mastery of traditional shadow manipulation. This technique, created by Naobito Zenin through decades of research and experimentation, represented a fundamentally different approach to combat enhancement that operated through manipulation of motion and perception, rather than summoning external entities to provide assistance and support. Projection sorcery's theoretical foundation rested on the principle that movement and time could be divided into discrete frames like animation cells, allowing practitioners to pre-plan sequences of motion that would execute with mechanical precision, regardless of changing battlefield conditions or opponent responses. The technique's effectiveness lay not in overwhelming power, but in perfect predictability and timing that created tactical advantages through superior positioning and coordination that exceeded what normal reaction times could achieve. The 24-frame limitation that governed projection sorcery's operation reflected both the technique's strength and its inherent constraints, requiring practitioners to develop strategic thinking that could anticipate opponent actions and environmental changes sufficiently far in advance to program effective responses within the temporal limitations that the technique imposed. Master-level practitioners like Naobito learned to chain multiple sequences together while maintaining awareness of how their pre-programmed actions affected ongoing tactical situations that continued to evolve while their committed movements executed automatically. The integration of projection sorcery into the Zenin clan's broader approach to combat and strategy represented the family's understanding that even the most powerful inherited techniques could benefit from supplementation through innovations that provided different types of advantages and capabilities. The combination of Ten Shadows' overwhelming power with projection sorcery's precision timing created tactical options that exceeded what either technique could achieve independently, demonstrating the clan's commitment to comprehensive mastery rather than reliance on single approaches to problem solving. The political structure of the Zenin clan reflected their status as the largest and most traditionally organized of the three great families, with hierarchical systems that had been refined through centuries of experience, managing large groups of practitioners whose abilities and loyalties required constant coordination and oversight. The clan's approach to internal governance emphasized collective decision-making, balanced by clear chains of command that could function effectively during crisis situations when immediate action was more important than consensus building. The succession practices that governed leadership transitions within the Zenin clan were based on complex evaluations of both inherited ability and demonstrated competence in managing the political and strategic challenges that defined clan leadership in an environment where external threats and internal rivalries created constant pressure for effective decision-making. The traditional preference for male leadership reflected cultural biases that limited the clan's access to the full range of talent available within their membership, while creating resentment and resistance that weakened overall cohesion and effectiveness. The misogynistic practices that characterized Zenin clan culture represented one of the most troubling aspects of their approach to family management and talent development: systematic discrimination that prevented approximately half of their members from achieving their full potential, while creating internal conflicts that enemies could exploit through various forms of manipulation and psychological warfare. The treatment of women as secondary members despite their demonstrated capabilities in combat and technique mastery, reflected adherence to traditional prejudices that served no practical purpose while creating significant strategic vulnerabilities. The case of Maki Zenin demonstrated both the destructive effects of the clan's discriminatory practices and the potential that was being wasted through systematic exclusion of capable individuals based on criteria that had no relationship to actual ability or dedication to family welfare. Her development from despised family member to formidable sorcerer capable of single-handedly destroying the entire clan structure represented both personal triumph and institutional failure that revealed the fundamental contradictions inherent in the Zenin approach to power and authority. The internal politics that governed daily life within the Zenin compound reflected the complex relationships between different family branches and the competition for resources and recognition that characterized large organizations where individual achievement was balanced against collective identity and shared responsibility for family reputation and effectiveness. The various schemes and alliances that developed among family members created opportunities for both cooperation and betrayal that added layers of complexity to strategic planning and operational security. The relationship between Naobito Zenin and his sons represented the challenges that faced traditional patriarchal authority when individual capabilities and family loyalty came into conflict with changing circumstances and evolving threats that required adaptation of long-established approaches to leadership and decision-making. Naobito's recognition of his own limitations and his willingness to make arrangements that prioritized family survival over personal pride demonstrated wisdom that contrasted sharply with the rigid traditionalism that characterized much of the clan's approach to change and innovation. The succession crisis that followed Naobito's death revealed the fundamental weaknesses in the Zenin clan's approach to leadership transition and the way their emphasis on inherited ability over demonstrated competence created opportunities for external manipulation and internal conflict that threatened the family's continued existence as a coherent political entity. The revelation that Toji Fushiguro's son had been designated as the next clan head despite his youth and lack of connection to family culture demonstrated how external circumstances could override traditional practices when survival was at stake. Megumi Fushiguro's position as the designated heir to Zenin leadership represented both opportunity and challenge for a family that had never successfully integrated outsiders into their power structure while maintaining the cultural identity and tactical effectiveness that had sustained them through centuries of external pressure and internal evolution. His rejection of Zenin values and his commitment to alternative approaches to strength and responsibility created possibilities for reformation that the clan had never previously contemplated or attempted. The rapid deterioration of Zenin clan cohesion following the Shibuya incident and the broader collapse of traditional Jujutsu society reflected the family's dependence on external validation and institutional support for maintaining internal discipline and strategic focus. When the broader context that had given meaning to their traditional practices disappeared, the clan found itself unable to adapt quickly enough to prevent the kind of internal conflicts that had been contained but not resolved through previous approaches to family management and collective identity. The massacre that Maki Zenin inflicted upon her family represented the ultimate expression of accumulated resentment and the failure of traditional approaches to conflict resolution within family structures that prioritized hierarchy over justice and tradition over adaptation to changing circumstances. Her systematic elimination of family members who had participated in or benefited from discriminatory practices, demonstrated both the depth of the problems that had been allowed to fester and the tragic consequences of failing to address institutional injustices before they reached crisis proportions. The symbolic significance of the Zenin clan's destruction extended beyond the immediate tactical and political implications to represent the end of an approach to family organization and power management that had become incompatible with the evolving requirements of supernatural protection and the changing values of practitioners who demanded both effectiveness and ethical consistency from their leaders and institutions. The shadows that had defined their technique mastery ultimately consumed the family itself. Darkness, overtaking those who had learned to command it, but never to escape its fundamental nature. The legacy of the Zenin clan within Jujutsu history remains complex and contradictory, encompassing both remarkable achievements in technique development and strategic thinking, alongside troubling examples of how inherited power could perpetuate injustices and create vulnerabilities that ultimately proved fatal to the institutions they were designed to protect. Their story serves as cautionary tale about the importance of adaptation and the dangers of allowing traditional practices to become more important than the values and objectives they were originally designed to serve. The Kamo family stands as perhaps the most politically astute and diplomatically sophisticated of the three great families. Their millennium-long ascent to power built not upon the overwhelming individual brilliance that characterized the Gojo clan or the collective strength that defined the Zenin, but rather upon a patient understanding of how influence could be cultivated through careful manipulation of the most fundamental force that sustained all living things. Their mastery of blood manipulation represents more than mere technique inheritance. It embodies a philosophical approach to power that recognizes the intimate connection between life and death, healing and harm, protection and domination that exists within every drop of crimson that flows through human veins. The origins of the Kamo family's signature technique can be traced to the earliest periods of Jujutsu development, when primitive healers and warriors discovered that the essence of vitality itself could be directed and controlled through precise application of cursed energy, guided by understanding of biological processes that existed at the intersection of medical knowledge and supernatural perception. These ancestral practitioners learned that blood was not merely the physical medium that transported oxygen and nutrients throughout living bodies, but also a form of cursed energy so fundamental and pervasive that mastering its manipulation provided access to powers that seemed to violate the basic laws of biology while actually operating according to deeper principles that governed the relationship between consciousness and physical form. The theoretical foundation of blood manipulation rests upon recognition that the crimson fluid that sustains all vertebrate life contains within itself the complete blueprint of existence, carrying not only the genetic information that determines physical characteristics, but also the spiritual essence that connects individual consciousness to the broader web of life that encompasses all living things. Early Kamo practitioners understood intuitively that controlling blood meant controlling life itself, that the ability to manipulate this most intimate and essential aspect of biological existence provided leverage over other beings that transcended normal categories of influence and persuasion. The versatility of blood manipulation as a combat technique derives from its practitioners' ability to weaponize the very substance that their opponents depend upon for survival, turning the biological necessities of life into instruments of destruction or control that operate from within the target's own body rather than through external assault that can be defended against through conventional means. The technique's applications range from direct offensive capabilities that can cause hemorrhaging or clotting in enemy circulatory systems, to defensive uses that enhance physical capabilities through optimized blood flow and oxygenation of muscle tissue during combat operations. The healing applications of blood manipulation represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the technique's development, requiring practitioners to understand not only how blood normally functions within healthy bodies, but also how its flow and composition can be adjusted to accelerate natural recovery processes and counteract damage that would prove fatal to individuals who lacked access to such intervention. Master-level Kamo sorcerers learn to perform emergency medical procedures through cursed energy alone, repairing damaged blood vessels, replacing lost blood volume, and even stimulating the production of new blood cells to address various forms of trauma and disease. The political implications of possessing healing abilities that exceeded anything available through conventional medicine created opportunities for the Kamo family to build relationships and accumulate favors that extended far beyond the Jujutsu community into the broader spheres of influence that governed Japanese society throughout its historical development. Their services as healers and medical consultants provided them with access to powerful individuals and institutions that might otherwise have remained closed to supernatural practitioners, creating networks of obligation and mutual benefit that enhanced their political position within both hidden and conventional power structures. The diplomatic approach that characterized Kamo family strategy throughout their rise to prominence reflected their understanding that sustainable influence required building coalitions and managing relationships rather than relying upon demonstrations of overwhelming force that might achieve immediate objectives while creating long-term enemies and resentments that could prove costly in future conflicts. Their technique's nature as something that could benefit others as easily as harm them provided natural foundations for the kind of positive sum interactions that created genuine allies rather than merely intimidated subordinates. The family's approach to internal organization and leadership development emphasized intellectual sophistication and strategic thinking over pure combat effectiveness, understanding that their political position depended more upon their ability to navigate complex social and institutional relationships than upon their capacity to dominate through superior firepower. This emphasis on mental development and cultural refinement created family members who were uniquely qualified to serve as intermediaries and negotiators in situations where other clans might resort to violence or intimidation to achieve their objectives. The historical role of the Kamo family as mediators and diplomatic facilitators between the other great families reflected both their natural inclinations toward compromise and cooperation and their strategic recognition that positioning themselves as neutral arbiters provided opportunities to influence outcomes while avoiding the direct confrontations that characterized relationships between the more militant Gojo and Zenin clans. Their willingness to serve as honest brokers in inter-family disputes earned them respect and gratitude that translated into political capital that could be deployed when their own interests were at stake. The evolution of blood manipulation techniques through successive generations of Kamo practitioners demonstrated the family's commitment to continuous innovation and adaptation that kept their inherited abilities relevant and effective despite changing combat conditions and evolving threats that challenged traditional approaches to supernatural warfare. Each generation built upon the discoveries and refinements of their predecessors while developing new applications that reflected contemporary needs and opportunities for advancing both individual capability and collective family influence. The development of the flowing red scale technique represented a major breakthrough in the application of blood manipulation to enhance physical performance during combat operations, allowing practitioners to optimize their cardiovascular systems for maximum efficiency while maintaining the kind of precise control necessary to execute complex techniques under extreme stress. This innovation transformed Kamo sorcerers from primarily support-oriented practitioners into formidable combatants, capable of engaging elite opponents on equal terms, while retaining their traditional advantages in healing and battlefield medicine. The blood manipulation technique's capacity for creating semi-permanent constructs through crystallization and hardening of blood components provided Kamo practitioners with tactical flexibility that exceeded what most inherited techniques could achieve, allowing them to adapt their approach to specific situations while maintaining consistent effectiveness across a wide range of combat scenarios and strategic objectives. The ability to create weapons, armor, and barriers from their own blood gave them independence from external equipment while ensuring that their most important tools were always available, regardless of circumstances or preparation time. The darker applications of blood manipulation that emerged during periods of intense conflict revealed the technique's potential for psychological warfare and interrogation that exceeded anything achievable through conventional methods. As practitioners learned to inflict precise forms of suffering that left no permanent physical damage, while creating experiences that were impossible to endure or forget. These capabilities were rarely employed except in extreme circumstances, but their existence served as deterrent that enhanced the family's reputation for being dangerous enemies despite their preference for diplomatic solutions to most conflicts. The shame that settled upon the Kamo family name due to the experiments conducted by Noritoshi Kamo during the early 20th century represented perhaps the greatest crisis in their millennium-long history, as the actions of a single family member threatened to destroy the carefully cultivated reputation for ethical conduct and beneficial service that had been the foundation of their political influence. The revelation that someone bearing their name had used blood manipulation to conduct horrific experiments on unwilling subjects created associations between their inherited technique and moral corruption that required generations of careful rehabilitation to overcome. The creation of the cursed womb death paintings through Noritoshi Kamo's experiments with combining human and cursed spirit essence represented both the pinnacle of theoretical blood manipulation research and the ultimate expression of how inherited power could be corrupted when divorced from the ethical frameworks that gave such abilities meaning and purpose. The 9 hybrid beings that resulted from these experiments existed in states between life and death that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and identity, while serving as permanent reminders of the consequences that accompanied the pursuit of knowledge without regard for moral constraints. The family's response to the scandal created by the original Noritoshi Kamo's actions demonstrated their commitment to collective responsibility and institutional accountability that distinguished them from other families who might have attempted to distance themselves from individual members' misconduct. The Kamo clan accepted the burden of their ancestors' crimes while working systematically to rebuild trust and demonstrate that his actions were aberrations that did not reflect their true values or typical approach to technique, development, and application. The infiltration of the Kamo family by Kenjaku through his possession of Noritoshi Kamo's body represented the culmination of a centuries-long strategy to gain access to blood manipulation capabilities for purposes that extended far beyond anything the family had previously contemplated or would have willingly supported. the ancient sorcerers' understanding of how to exploit their techniques' potential for biological experimentation and manipulation exceeded even their own knowledge, while serving objectives that fundamentally contradicted everything they had worked to achieve throughout their history. Kenjaku's use of blood manipulation to create the conditions necessary for producing the Cursed Womb death paintings revealed capabilities within their inherited technique that the Kamo family had never fully explored or understood, demonstrating how even the most familiar abilities could be pushed beyond recognized limitations by practitioners who possessed sufficient knowledge and complete freedom from ethical constraints. The hybrid beings that resulted from his experiments represented both unprecedented achievements in cursed energy manipulation and violations of natural law that challenged basic assumptions about the boundaries between different forms of existence. The psychological impact of Kenjaku's revelation that he had been manipulating their family history for generations, while wearing the face of their most shameful ancestor, created trauma that extended beyond individual family members to affect their collective identity and confidence in their own judgment and security measures. The discovery that someone had been operating within their most intimate circles while pursuing objectives that threatened everything they valued forced fundamental reconsideration of their approaches to trust, verification, and institutional protection. The modern era challenges that faced the Kamo family reflected broader changes in Jujutsu society that reduced the relative importance of the diplomatic and mediating roles that had been central to their traditional approach to maintaining influence and relevance within the complex political structures that governed supernatural practitioners. The increasing prominence of direct confrontation and overwhelming individual power created environments where their strengths were less valuable, while their preference for compromise and cooperation was sometimes interpreted as weakness or lack of commitment. The development of young Noritoshi Kamo as a practitioner who embodied both technical mastery of the family's inherited abilities and commitment to ethical application that explicitly rejected the corrupted legacy of his namesake represented hope for the family's ability to reclaim their reputation while adapting their traditional approaches to meet contemporary challenges. His integration of blood manipulation with modern strategic thinking and moral philosophy demonstrated how inherited techniques could evolve without losing their essential character or abandoning the values that gave them meaning. The political maneuvering that surrounded the Kamo family's attempts to maintain their position within the three great families during the crisis periods that marked the end of traditional Jujutsu society revealed both their sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics and their vulnerability to forces that operated outside the diplomatic frameworks that had historically protected their interests. Their skills in negotiation and relationship management proved insufficient when facing opponents who rejected compromise and cooperation in favor of destruction and domination. The ultimate fate of the Kamo family, within the broader collapse of traditional Jujutsu society, reflected the tragic irony that their greatest strengths, their ability to build bridges and find common ground between opposing forces, became irrelevant in circumstances where the fundamental structures that had given meaning to such activities were being systematically destroyed by forces that viewed cooperation and compromise as obstacles to be eliminated rather than values to be preserved and protected. The legacy of the Kamo family within Jujutsu history encompasses both their remarkable achievements in technique development and political sophistication, alongside the sobering reminder that even the most carefully cultivated institutions and reputations remain vulnerable to corruption and manipulation by forces that understood how to exploit the very qualities that made such institutions valuable and worthy of preservation. Their story serves as testament to both the possibilities and limitations of influence built upon service and cooperation rather than domination and fear. The political web that binds the three great families to the broader structures of Jujutsu society represents one of the most sophisticated systems of influence and control ever developed for managing the intersection between supernatural, power, and conventional governance. A carefully constructed hierarchy that has maintained the delicate balance between public safety and institutional secrecy for over a millennium. This intricate network of relationships, obligations, and authorities extends its tendrils through every level of Japanese society, from the most mundane administrative offices to the highest echelons of government power, creating a shadow system of governance that operates parallel to but largely invisible from the democratic institutions that ordinary citizens believe control their nation's destiny. The fundamental structure of this political arrangement rests upon the recognition that supernatural threats to public safety cannot be addressed through conventional governmental mechanisms, requiring specialized knowledge and capabilities that exist only within the Jujutsu community, while simultaneously demanding resources and legal authority that can be provided only through official governmental channels. This mutual dependence created the foundation for relationships that have evolved over centuries into complex webs of obligation and cooperation that serve the interests of both hidden and visible power structures. The appointment process for the head of Jujutsu headquarters demonstrates the intricate balance between democratic accountability and specialized expertise that characterizes the entire system, with the Prime Minister holding ultimate authority over the selection, while relying entirely upon nominations provided by the three great families whose understanding of supernatural threats and practitioner capabilities far exceeds anything available through conventional, governmental analysis. This arrangement ensures that leadership positions are filled by individuals who possess the specialized knowledge necessary for effective decision-making, while maintaining the constitutional requirement that such appointments ultimately derive their legitimacy from elected officials who are accountable to the general public. The influence that the three great families exercise over this nomination process extends far beyond simple candidate selection into comprehensive evaluation of political reliability, institutional loyalty, and strategic thinking that aligns with family interests, while serving the broader objectives of supernatural threat management and public safety. The family's ability to shape these appointments through their control over information about candidates' qualifications and their capacity to influence the operational effectiveness of chosen leaders creates leverage that extends throughout the entire administrative hierarchy of Jujutsu society. The corruption inherent in this system manifests not through simple bribery or explicit quid pro quo arrangements, but through the more subtle mechanisms of institutional capture and regulatory capture that develop when specialized. Knowledge becomes concentrated within small groups, whose interests may diverge from those of the broader populations they are supposed to serve. The family's position as both regulators and regulated parties creates conflicts of interest that are difficult to address through conventional oversight mechanisms, while their monopoly on essential expertise makes external evaluation of their recommendations nearly impossible. The appointment of school principals and other educational administrators through family nominations rather than merit-based selection demonstrates how deeply the influence of the three great families penetrates into the fundamental processes of knowledge, transmission, and institutional development that shape future generations of Jujutsu practitioners. This control over educational leadership allows the families to ensure that their preferred approaches to technique development, strategic thinking, and social organization are perpetuated through formal instruction, while alternative perspectives are marginalized or excluded entirely from institutional discourse. The relationship between Jujutsu headquarters and the conventional Japanese government operates through carefully maintained channels of communication and coordination that allow information sharing and resource allocation while preserving the secrecy that protects ordinary citizens from knowledge of supernatural threats that might cause panic or social instability. These relationships require constant management and adjustment as political conditions change and new leaders assume positions within both governmental and jujutsu hierarchies, creating ongoing opportunities for influence peddling and institutional manipulation. The three great families' ability to maintain influence over governmental policy extends beyond the jujutsu-specific positions that they directly control into broader areas of public administration where their wealth, social connections, and specialized knowledge create opportunities for subtle but persistent pressure on decision-makers who may not fully understand the implications of their choices for supernatural threat management and public safety. This influence operates through the same mechanisms of lobbying, campaign contributions, and revolving door employment that characterize conventional special interest politics. The secrecy requirements that govern all aspects of Jujutsu society create additional opportunities for institutional capture and corruption, as the normal mechanisms of public oversight and democratic accountability cannot operate effectively when the basic facts of governmental activity must be concealed from citizens and their elected representatives. The family's role as guardians of these secrets gives them effective veto power over any governmental actions that might compromise operational security, while providing them with cover for activities that might not withstand public scrutiny. The intelligence sharing arrangements between jujutsu institutions and conventional law enforcement and national security agencies create complex relationships where information flows primarily in one direction, while the agencies that receive this intelligence lack the expertise necessary to evaluate its accuracy or completeness. This asymmetry allows the three great families to shape governmental understanding of threats and appropriate responses, while maintaining control over the narrative that guides policy decisions and resource allocation. The financial mechanisms that support jujutsu operations through governmental funding channels operate through budget processes that are largely invisible to normal oversight procedures, with appropriations hidden within larger budget categories and expenditures justified through classified briefings that cannot be subject to normal audit and evaluation procedures. This financial opacity creates opportunities for the families to direct public resources toward their preferred objectives, while avoiding the accountability measures that govern other governmental activities. The legal frameworks that govern Jujutsu society operate through special jurisdictional arrangements that place supernatural crimes and conflicts under the authority of specialized courts and administrative procedures that are staffed and controlled by individuals whose selection is heavily influenced by family recommendations and preferences. This parallel legal system creates opportunities for bias and favoritism, while insulating family members and their allies from the normal consequences of misconduct or criminal behavior. The coordination between family political activities and their business interests creates additional layers of complexity and potential corruption, as their legitimate commercial enterprises provide vehicles for money laundering, influence peddling, and the exchange of favors with governmental officials and conventional business leaders who may not fully understand the true nature of their partners' activities and objectives. These business relationships create dependencies and obligations that extend family influence far beyond their nominal areas of expertise and authority. The succession planning and leadership development processes within the families themselves are deeply intertwined with their political strategies and governmental relationships, as potential heirs must be prepared not only for technical mastery of inherited techniques, but also for the complex diplomatic and strategic challenges that accompany family leadership within systems where personal relationships, institutional knowledge are more important than formal qualifications or democratic legitimacy. The crisis management procedures that govern responses to major supernatural threats require rapid coordination between family leadership, Jujutsu headquarters, and conventional governmental authorities through communication channels and decision-making processes that bypass normal democratic procedures and constitutional protections in favor of efficiency and operational security. These emergency powers create opportunities for abuse while concentrating authority in ways that may be difficult to reverse once immediate crises have passed. The international dimensions of family political influence extend beyond Japan's borders through relationships with supernatural practitioners and governmental agencies in other nations, creating networks of obligation and cooperation that operate entirely outside normal diplomatic channels and treaty frameworks, while potentially affecting Japan's foreign policy and international relationships in ways that are invisible to normal governmental oversight and public scrutiny. The cultural and social influence that the families exercise through their control over educational institutions, media relationships, and community organizations creates additional mechanisms for shaping public opinion and social attitudes that support their political objectives, while maintaining the secrecy and social distance necessary for effective supernatural threat management. This soft power complements their formal political influence, while creating resilience against challenges to their authority that might emerge through democratic processes or social movements. The technological and scientific research that supports Jujutsu Society's operations requires coordination with conventional academic institutions and commercial research organizations through relationships that must balance the need for advanced capabilities with secrecy requirements that prevent normal peer review and intellectual property protections. The family's influence over these research priorities affects not only supernatural threat management, but also broader technological development that may have significant implications for conventional society and international competitiveness. The regulatory frameworks that govern the development and deployment of new Jujutsu techniques and technologies operate through processes that are controlled by family-influenced institutions without the safety testing, environmental impact assessment, and ethical review procedures that would normally apply to comparable activities in conventional society. This regulatory capture allows the families to pursue research and development priorities that serve their interests, while potentially creating risks for practitioners and the general public that might not be acceptable under normal oversight procedures. The long-term sustainability of this political system depends upon maintaining public ignorance of supernatural threats, while ensuring that the governmental resources and legal authorities necessary for addressing these threats remain available through family-controlled channels, creating fundamental contradictions that become increasingly difficult to manage as social attitudes toward governmental transparency and democratic accountability continue to evolve. The family's ability to adapt their political strategies to changing conditions while preserving their essential privileges and authorities will determine whether this system can survive the pressures created by social modernization and democratization. The ultimate vulnerability of this entire political arrangement lies in its dependence upon the continued effectiveness of the secrecy that protects it from public scrutiny and democratic challenge, as any significant breach of operational security or failure to manage major supernatural threats could expose the family's political activities to the kind of oversight and accountability measures that might fundamentally alter or eliminate the special privileges and authorities that have been the foundation of their influence for over 1,000 years. The rivalries that have defined relationships between the three great families for over a millennium represent far more than simple competitive tensions or territorial disputes, embodying instead fundamental philosophical differences about power, responsibility, and the proper role of inherited strength within human society that have shaped every aspect of Jujutsu politics and strategic thinking throughout their shared history. These conflicts arise not from petty jealousies or material competition, but from irreconcilable differences in worldview that make genuine cooperation impossible, except in the face of existential threats that transcend individual family interests and force temporary alliances that dissolve the moment immédiat danger passe. The historical roots of interfamily conflict can be traced to the earliest periods of their development as organized institutions, when the practical necessities of territorial division and resource allocation created natural points of friction between groups whose inherited techniques and strategic approaches often placed them in competition for the same objectives and opportunities. The Gojo family's emphasis on overwhelming individual excellence conflicted with the Zenin clan's collective strength model, while both approaches challenged the Kamo family's preference for diplomatic solutions and gradual influence accumulation that required stable relationships and predictable behavioral patterns from all parties involved. The philosophical dimensions of these rivalries extend far beyond tactical disagreements into fundamental questions about the nature of strength itself and the proper relationship between those who possess exceptional abilities and those who depend upon their protection for survival and prosperity. The Gojo family's approach to power as a tool for achieving immediate results through superior capability conflicted with traditional hierarchical models that emphasized gradual authority accumulation through institutional participation and relationship building over extended periods. The Zenin clan's commitment to traditional values and established social structures placed them in natural opposition to innovations and reforms that might challenge their accumulated advantages within existing systems, creating persistent tensions with both the Gojo family's iconoclastic individualism and the Kamo family's adaptive pragmatism that prioritized effective outcomes over adherence to traditional methods and established precedents. These ideological conflicts were expressed through policy disputes, strategic disagreements, and personal animosities that persisted across generations and created lasting institutional grudges. The territorial aspects of interfamily rivalry manifested through competition for influence over specific regions, institutions, and strategic resources that were essential for maintaining operational effectiveness and political relevance within Jujutsu society's complex hierarchy of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions. Each family sought to expand their sphere of influence while preventing rival families from gaining access to resources or strategic positions that might upset carefully maintained balances of power that had been established through previous conflicts and negotiations. The competition for talented practitioners and promising students created additional sources of friction as each family recognized that their long-term survival and effectiveness depended upon their ability to attract, develop, and retain individuals whose capabilities could contribute to family objectives while preventing rival families from gaining access to the same human resources. This competition extended beyond simple recruitment into complex schemes of influence, manipulation, and inducement that sometimes approached outright coercion in their intensity and scope. The most dramatic expression of inter-family rivalry occurred during the legendary battle between the Gojo family head, who possessed both the limitless technique and 6 eyes, and the Zenin clan leader, whose mastery of the 10 shadows technique had reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and power. This confrontation was not simply a contest between individual practitioners, but a symbolic resolution of fundamental questions about whether overwhelming individual capability or comprehensive collective strength represented the superior approach to supernatural threat management and social organization. The mutual destruction that concluded this legendary battle served multiple purposes within the broader context of inter-family relationships, demonstrating both the ultimate futility of direct confrontation between evenly matched opponents and the catastrophic costs that accompanied the pursuit of decisive victory through overwhelming force applied without regard for broader consequences or long-term strategic implications. The aftermath of this conflict created a cautionary precedent that influenced family behavior for generations, while establishing new parameters for acceptable levels of rivalry and competition. The political maneuvering that followed major conflicts between families involved complex negotiations and settlement arrangements that attempted to prevent future escalations, while preserving each family's essential interests and strategic positions within Jujutsu society's power structure. These agreements typically included territorial concessions, resource sharing arrangements, and mutual limitations on certain types of competitive activities that might trigger renewed hostilities or create opportunities for external forces to exploit inter-family divisions. The espionage and intelligence gathering activities that characterized ongoing rivalry between the families created parallel networks of information, collection, and analysis that sometimes exceeded governmental intelligence capabilities, while serving objectives that were not always aligned with broader national interests or public safety concerns. Each family maintained extensive surveillance operations focused on their rivals' activities, capabilities, and strategic planning, while attempting to protect their own operations from similar monitoring and infiltration efforts. The sabotage and indirect attacks that families employed against each other reflected their understanding that direct confrontation carried unacceptable risks, while indirect methods could achieve strategic objectives without triggering the prompts kind of escalatory responses that might lead to mutually destructive conflicts similar to the legendary battle that had claimed previous family heads. These indirect approaches included economic pressure, political manipulation, and targeted operations against rival family resources and personnel. The assassination attempts that targeted promising young practitioners from rival families represented perhaps the most extreme expression of inter-family competition, reflecting recognition that exceptional individuals could fundamentally alter existing power balances if allowed to develop their full potential while serving rival family interests. The most notable example of such targeting involved the numerous attempts on Satoru Gojo's life during his childhood and adolescence, when his potential to reshape Jujutsu society's entire power structure became apparent to observers who understood the implications of his inherited abilities. The defensive measures that families developed to protect their own members from rival family operations created increasingly sophisticated security systems and protocols that transformed family compounds into fortified installations while limiting the freedom and normal social development of individuals whose abilities made them valuable targets for enemy action. These security requirements created additional sources of tension and psychological pressure that affected family members' personal relationships and social integration, while consuming resources that might otherwise have been available for constructive purposes. The alliance-building activities that families pursued with lesser clans and independent practitioners created networks of obligation and mutual support that extended their effective power while providing buffers against direct confrontation with rival families whose capabilities might otherwise have made aggressive action too risky to contemplate. These alliances required careful management and constant maintenance, as the interests of allied groups did not always align perfectly with family objectives, while their reliability during crisis situations remained uncertain. The economic warfare that accompanied political and strategic rivalry included efforts to undermine rival families' financial resources through business competition, market manipulation, and targeted disruption of commercial activities that provided funding for their operations and political influence. These economic attacks were often more effective than direct confrontation, while being more difficult to trace and retaliate against through conventional means. The cultural and ideological campaigns that families waged against each other involved systematic efforts to undermine rival approaches to technique development, strategic thinking, and social organization through academic discourse, institutional influence, and public relations activities that shaped broader community attitudes and preferences. These campaigns sought to delegitimize rival philosophies while promoting family-preferred approaches as superior solutions to common challenges and objectives. The marriage and kinship politics that characterized inter-family relationships created complex webs of personal obligation and institutional connection that sometimes transcended formal rivalries, while creating new sources of tension and conflict when family loyalties came into tension with personal relationships and individual preferences. Strategic marriages were used both to cement temporary alliances and to create long-term influence opportunities within rival family structures. The educational and training competition between families extended beyond simple technique instruction into comprehensive efforts to demonstrate the superiority of their approaches to practitioner development through the performance and achievements of their members in various competitive contexts and practical applications. These educational rivalries influenced curriculum development, instructional methods, and evaluation criteria throughout Jujutsu society, while creating pressure for continuous innovation and improvement. The succession crises and leadership transitions within individual families created opportunities for rival families to attempt influence operations and political manipulation designed to ensure that new leaders would be either favorable to their interests or sufficiently weakened by internal conflicts to reduce their effectiveness as competitors and opponents. These intervention attempts required careful calibration to avoid triggering direct retaliation while achieving meaningful influence over rival family decision-making processes. The external threat responses that occasionally forced temporary cooperation between rival families demonstrated both their capacity for effective collaboration when circumstances demanded it, and the fundamental tensions that made such cooperation unstable and temporary. Despite their shared interests in addressing common challenges and threats, these temporary alliances typically dissolved immediately upon resolution of immediate crises, while leaving residual suspicions and resentments that complicated future cooperation efforts. The technological and technique innovation competition that characterized modern inter-family rivalry reflected their recognition that maintaining competitive advantages required continuous development of new capabilities and approaches that could provide decisive edges in future conflicts, while preventing rival families from achieving similar breakthroughs that might upset existing power balances. This innovation competition accelerated the pace of development throughout Jujutsu society, while creating additional sources of secrecy and mistrust. The ultimate irony of the interfamily rivalries that defined Jujutsu society for over a millennium lies in their contribution to the very institutional weaknesses and strategic vulnerabilities that enabled external forces like Kenjaku to manipulate and ultimately destroy the traditional power structure that these rivalries had been designed to protect and preserve. The energy and resources devoted to competition with each other left the families vulnerable to threats that understood how to exploit their divisions while appearing to serve their individual interests and objectives. The modern era crisis that began with Satoru Gojo's emergence as the undisputed pinnacle of Jujutsu power represents a fundamental disruption of political and social equilibria that had maintained stability within the three great families' sphere of influence for over a millennium, transforming carefully balanced systems of mutual constraint and shared authority into chaotic struggles for relevance in a world where traditional sources of legitimacy and control had been rendered obsolete by the overwhelming capabilities of a single individual whose strength transcended every previously established category of power and influence. The birth of Satoru Gojo on December 7th, 1989, marked the beginning of the end for the complex web of political arrangements that had governed Jujutsu society since its formal establishment, though the full implications of this transformation would not become apparent until years later when his abilities reached maturity and his approach to wielding power began to challenge fundamental assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and the proper relationship between individual capability and institutional structures designed around collective decision-making and shared responsibility for outcomes. The immediate impact of Gojo's existence upon interfamily power dynamics was both dramatic and subtle, creating obvious shifts in the balance of influence that favored the Gojo family while generating less visible, but ultimately more significant changes in how all three families understood their strategic positions and long-term prospects within a system that had suddenly become dominated by capabilities that exceeded anything their traditional approaches to power, accumulation, and maintenance could hope to match or counter through conventional means. The assassination attempts that began during Gojo's infancy and continued throughout his childhood represented desperate efforts by rival families and external enemies to prevent the fundamental restructuring of Jujutsu society that his continued development and eventual assumption of active leadership roles would inevitably produce. These elimination efforts reflected accurate understanding that his potential represented an existential threat to existing power structures while demonstrating the inadequacy of traditional methods for addressing challenges that transcended normal categories of political and strategic competition. The failure of these assassination attempts served not only to protect Gojo personally, but also to demonstrate the futility of conventional approaches to managing threats that operated on scales and through mechanisms that exceeded the theoretical frameworks and practical capabilities that had previously defined the limits of what individual practitioners could achieve through technique mastery and strategic planning. Each failed attempt served as proof that the traditional tools of interfamily competition had become obsolete in the face of capabilities that approached theoretical perfection. The educational innovations that Gojo introduced during his tenure as an instructor at Tokyo Jujutsu High represented direct challenges to the pedagogical monopolies that the three great families had maintained over practitioner development and institutional knowledge transmission, creating alternative pathways for talent cultivation and strategic thinking that bypassed family-controlled systems while producing results that exceeded what traditional approaches had achieved through centuries of accumulated experience and resource investment. The political implications of Gojo's teaching methods extended far beyond their immediate effects on student development into fundamental questions about the legitimacy and effectiveness of family-based approaches to knowledge, preservation, and institutional leadership that had been central to Jujutsu Society's organizational structure since its earliest periods. His demonstration that superior outcomes could be achieved through individual innovation and direct mentorship challenged the entire theoretical foundation upon which family political authority was based. The systematic undermining of higher-up authority that characterized Gojo's approach to institutional relationships reflected both his personal contempt for bureaucratic inefficiency and his strategic understanding that existing power structures were incompatible with the kind of rapid adaptation and decisive action that would be necessary for addressing the evolving threats that conventional leadership was either unable to recognize or unwilling to confront through methods that might compromise their political positions and traditional prerogatives. The growing isolation of the three great families from actual decision-making processes related to major supernatural threats reflected their inability to provide meaningful contributions to strategic planning and operational execution in contexts where Gojo's capabilities made their traditional resources and expertise largely irrelevant, while their political maneuvering and institutional conservatism actively hindered effective responses to crisis situations that demanded immediate action rather than careful consultation and consensus building. The Shibuya incident represented the culmination of tensions that had been building throughout Gojo's career between his individualistic approach to problem solving and the collective decision-making processes that characterized traditional Jujutsu Society governance, creating circumstances where his capture and removal from active participation would fundamentally alter strategic calculations and operational capabilities in ways that exposed the underlying weaknesses and dependencies that had been masked by his overwhelming personal effectiveness. The immediate aftermath of Gojo's sealing revealed how completely the existing power structure had become dependent upon his individual capabilities, while failing to develop alternative approaches or backup systems that could maintain operational effectiveness in his absence, leaving the three great families and their associated institutions unprepared for the kinds of challenges that emerged once their primary strategic asset was no longer available to address threats through direct application of superior force. The political opportunism that characterized the family's response to Gojo's capture demonstrated their prioritization of immediate advantage over long-term strategic thinking. As attempts to exploit his absence for partisan gain and traditional score settling created additional vulnerabilities and divisions that hostile forces were quick to identify and exploit for their own purposes. The declaration that removing his seal would constitute criminal activity represented both acknowledgement of his importance and abdication of responsibility for addressing the consequences of his absence. The execution orders that were issued against Yuji Itadori and Principal Yaga in the wake of the Shibuya incident reflected the family's reversion to traditional approaches to threat management that prioritized institutional control and symbolic authority over practical effectiveness and moral consideration, demonstrating how quickly supposed leaders could abandon principles and strategic wisdom when their positions were threatened by circumstances that exceeded their normal capabilities and experience. The collapse of normal governance procedures during the crisis period that followed Gojo's sealing created opportunities for external manipulation and infiltration that the families were unprepared to recognize or counter, as their focus on immediate tactical concerns and short-term political advantage prevented them from developing comprehensive understanding of the broader, strategic situation and the various forces that were working to exploit their fare. weaknesses, and divisions. The emergence of the culling game, as a direct result of Kenjaku's long-term planning, represented the ultimate expression of how external enemies had learned to weaponize the family's structural weaknesses and competitive instincts against themselves, creating circumstances where their traditional responses would serve enemy objectives, while their inability to adapt quickly to radically changed conditions would prevent effective counter-strategies from being developed and implemented. The systematic elimination of traditional authority figures and institutional leadership during the culling game period reflected both the inherent vulnerabilities that had been created through centuries of political complacency and strategic stagnation, and the ease with which determined opponents could exploit systems that had been designed for managing internal competition rather than defending against existential threats that operated outside normal frameworks of negotiation and accommodation. The transformation of Jujutsu society from hierarchical institution into anarchic battlefield demonstrated how quickly established order could dissolve when the underlying assumptions about power, distribution, and authority legitimacy were challenged by circumstances that exceeded the theoretical and practical frameworks upon which traditional governance systems had been constructed, leaving former leaders struggling to maintain relevance in contexts where their specialized knowledge and accumulated influence provided little advantage. The inability of the three great families to maintain their traditional roles and influence during the crisis periods that defined the modern era reflected not simply tactical failures or strategic miscalculations, but fundamental incompatibilities between their organizational approaches and the requirements for effective leadership in environments characterized by rapid change, existential threats, and the need for innovation that transcended traditional boundaries and established precedents. The irony of Gojo's dual role as both the agent of traditional authority's destruction and the only force capable of preserving the values and objectives that such authority claimed to serve created philosophical and practical contradictions that none of the families were equipped to resolve through their traditional approaches to political analysis and strategic planning, leaving them paralyzed between recognition of his necessity and resentment of their own obsolescence. The ultimate failure of the three great families to adapt their approaches and capabilities to the realities of modern supernatural warfare reflected deeper problems with institutional structures that prioritized continuity over effectiveness and traditional authority over practical competence, creating vulnerabilities that had been accumulating for generations, but became critical only when confronted by challenges that exceeded every previous precedent and demanded responses that transcended established procedures and comfortable assumptions. The legacy of this modern crisis period extends beyond the immediate tactical and political consequences to encompass fundamental questions about the viability of hereditary leadership and traditional authority in contexts where individual capability and adaptive innovation provide decisive advantages over accumulated institutional knowledge and established relationship networks that had previously formed the foundation of effective governance and strategic decision-making within Jujutsu society's complex hierarchy of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions. The inherited techniques that define the three great families represent far more than mere collections of supernatural abilities passed down through bloodlines, embodying instead the crystallized wisdom and accumulated experience of countless generations whose lives were dedicated to perfecting specific approaches to manipulating cursed energy in ways that reflected fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of power, responsibility, and the proper relationship between individual capability and collective human welfare. These techniques serve as both practical tools for addressing supernatural threats and symbolic expressions of family identity that shape how their practitioners understand themselves, their obligations, and their place within the complex hierarchy of relationships that governs Jujutsu society. The process by which inherited techniques are transmitted from one generation to the next involves far more than simple genetic inheritance or mechanical instruction in specific procedures, requiring instead a comprehensive form of cultural and spiritual transmission that encompasses not only the technical knowledge necessary for technique execution, but also the philosophical frameworks, ethical principles, and strategic thinking patterns that give such abilities meaning and purpose within broader contexts of human experience and social responsibility. The burden that accompanies inheritance of family techniques extends beyond the obvious responsibilities that come with possessing exceptional capabilities, encompassing psychological pressures and social expectations that can prove overwhelming for individuals whose personal inclinations and natural talents may not align perfectly with the roles and identities that their inherited abilities seem to demand from them and from the communities that depend upon their effective performance of traditional functions and obligations. The limitless technique of the Gojo family represents perhaps the most intellectually demanding of all inherited abilities, requiring practitioners to develop mathematical understanding and computational capabilities that exceed normal human cognitive limitations, while maintaining the kind of perfect spatial awareness and theoretical comprehension that allows conscious manipulation of fundamental physical forces through pure application of will, guided by supernatural perception that transcends ordinary categories of sensory experience and rational analysis. The psychological isolation that accompanies mastery of the limitless technique reflects not only the practical difficulties of relating to others, whose experiences and capabilities exist within entirely different frameworks of possibility and limitation, but also the fundamental loneliness that comes from possessing abilities that place their wielders in categories of existence that have no meaningful parallels within normal human experience, creating barriers to genuine connection and understanding that persist regardless of personal desires for companionship and emotional intimacy. The Six Eyes mutation that occasionally appears within the Gojo bloodline represents an evolutionary adaptation that provides its bearers with perceptual capabilities that approach theoretical perfection while imposing cognitive and emotional costs that may ultimately prove more burdensome than the advantages such abilities provide, creating individuals whose understanding of reality is so comprehensive and detailed that ordinary human concerns and relationships may seem trivial or insignificant by comparison to the cosmic forces and mathematical principles that govern their daily experience. The combination of limitless and six eyes within single individuals creates synergies that transcend simple addition of separate capabilities, producing practitioners whose power approaches divine authority over fundamental forces while their human limitations and emotional needs remain unchanged, creating profound contradictions between what they can accomplish through technique mastery and what they require for psychological health and meaningful existence within communities of people who cannot share or fully comprehend their pole experiences. The Ten Shadows technique of the Zenin family demands different forms of sacrifice and commitment from its practitioners, requiring them to develop the kind of spiritual discipline and psychological resilience necessary for maintaining stable relationships with entities whose consciousness and motivations exist outside normal categories of human understanding, while accepting responsibility for the actions and consequences that result from decisions made by beings whose thought processes may be fundamentally incompatible with human ethical frameworks and strategic objectives. The progression system that governs access to more powerful Shikigami within the Ten Shadows technique reflects the family's understanding that premature exposure to entities whose capabilities and independence exceed the practitioner's ability to maintain control creates risks that extend far beyond individual safety toward broader threats to community welfare and institutional stability that could result from summoned beings whose power is matched by autonomous will and potentially hostile intentions toward human civilization. The adaptation mechanisms built into the Ten Shadows technique through entities like Mahoraga represent both the ultimate expression of the technique's potential and its most dangerous application, creating beings whose capacity for evolution and counter-strategy development may eventually exceed their summoner's ability to predict, control, or dismiss, potentially creating permanent threats that continue to exist and develop even after the practitioners who originally summoned them have died or lost the ability to maintain their contractual relationships. The blood manipulation technique of the Kamo family requires practitioners to develop intimate understanding of biological processes and life force dynamics that places them in constant contact with the fundamental essence of mortality, vitality, creating psychological pressures and philosophical challenges that arise from the wielder's ability to give and take life through conscious manipulation of the most basic biological functions that sustain conscious existence. Physical health. The healing applications of blood manipulation create moral obligations and ethical dilemmas that extend far beyond simple combat effectiveness, as practitioners must constantly decide whose lives deserve preservation and whose suffering merits intervention, while understanding that their choices will determine outcomes that affect not only immediate patients, but also the broader communities and relationships that depend upon those individuals for support, leadership, and emotional connection. The darker applications of blood manipulation that enable psychological torture and biological control create temptations for abuse of power that may prove irresistible for practitioners whose understanding of life and death has been shaped by constant exposure to techniques that reduce human existence to mechanical processes that can be manipulated for strategic advantage without regard for the dignity and autonomy that give individual consciousness meaning and value. The evolution of inherited techniques across generations reflects the ongoing interaction between traditional knowledge and contemporary innovation, as each practitioner discovers new applications and refinements that build upon ancestral wisdom while addressing challenges and opportunities that previous generations could not have anticipated or prepared for through their original technique development and theoretical framework establishment. The stagnation that can affect inherited technique development occurs when families become too conservative in their approach to innovation, or too protective of traditional methods, to encourage experimentation and creative adaptation that might reveal new possibilities while risking temporary reduction in effectiveness or disruption of established training procedures and institutional relationships that have provided stability and predictability for extended periods. The tragedy of family members who are born without their clan's signature abilities reflects both the genetic randomness that affects all forms of inheritance and the social systems that have developed around assumptions of capability and potential that may prove false for individuals whose value and identity become defined entirely by their relationship to abilities they do not possess and cannot develop, regardless of their dedication, intelligence, or commitment to family welfare and institutional objectives. The philosophical frameworks that develop around specific inherited techniques shape how their practitioners understand fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human purpose, in ways that may create incompatibilities between family members whose different approaches to technique application reflect underlying disagreements about ethics, strategy, and the proper goals of supernatural power that cannot be resolved through simple compromise or accommodation. The competitive dynamics that emerge between practitioners of different inherited techniques create incentives for innovation and excellence, while potentially fostering resentments and rivalries that undermine the cooperation and mutual support that would be necessary for addressing threats and challenges that exceed what any single approach to technique mastery could handle effectively through individual application of specialized capabilities and strategic thinking patterns. The integration challenges that face practitioners who must learn to coordinate their inherited abilities with conventional weapons, modern technology, and collaborative strategies that involve individuals whose capabilities and approaches to problem solving may be fundamentally different from their own, create ongoing requirements for adaptation and compromise that test both technical flexibility and personal humility in ways that traditional training methods may not adequately address. The succession planning that governs how inherited techniques are transmitted to future generations must balance preservation of essential knowledge and capabilities with recognition that changing circumstances and evolving threats may require modifications and innovations that challenge traditional approaches while maintaining the core principles and strategic advantages that made such techniques valuable and effective throughout their historical development and practical application. The ultimate irony of inherited technique mastery lies in the possibility that the most perfect expressions of such abilities may transcend the family-based systems that created and preserved them, producing practitioners whose capabilities and understanding exceed the institutional frameworks within which they were developed, while their achievements inspire changes that make traditional approaches to technique inheritance and family-based knowledge transmission obsolete or counterproductive for future generations who face different challenges and opportunities than those that shaped their ancestral heritage and cultural development. The emergence of a new generation within the three great families during the final decades of the traditional Jujutsu order represents both the culmination of centuries of inherited wisdom and the beginning of fundamental challenges to assumptions about bloodline authority, technique mastery, and the proper relationship between individual capability and collective responsibility that had defined family identity and strategic thinking since their earliest establishment as dominant forces within supernatural society. These younger practitioners, shaped by educational experiences and social conditions that differed dramatically from those that had molded their predecessors, brought perspectives and approaches to inherited power that questioned basic premises about how such abilities should be developed, deployed, and understood within broader frameworks of human welfare and social progress. The educational innovations introduced by instructors like Satoru Gojo created opportunities for young family members to develop relationships and perspectives that transcended traditional boundaries between clans, while exposing them to alternative approaches to technique mastery and strategic thinking that challenged the insularity and competitive hostility that had characterized interfamily relationships throughout their historical development. These educational experiences fostered collaboration and mutual respect that stood in stark contrast to the rivalries and suspicions that had been cultivated through previous generations of family-centered training and political indoctrination. The philosophical evolution that characterized younger practitioners reflected their exposure to broader ranges of human experience and moral consideration that extended beyond the narrow focus on family advancement and competitive advantage that had shaped their ancestors' understanding of purpose and obligation. Within Jujutsu society's complex hierarchy of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions, this expanded moral awareness created tensions with traditional family expectations while opening possibilities for more inclusive and ethically grounded approaches to wielding inherited power in service of objectives that transcended clan-specific interests and historical grievances. Megumi Fushiguro's relationship with the Zenin family represents perhaps the most dramatic example of how younger generations could challenge and ultimately reject traditional approaches to inherited authority and family obligation, demonstrating through his conscious choice to prioritize personal values over bloodline loyalty that individual moral development could transcend the constraints and expectations that hereditary systems attempted to impose upon those who possessed valuable abilities and strategic importance within established power structures. The complexity of Megumi's position as both inheritor of the Ten Shadows technique and conscious opponent of Zenin family values created unprecedented circumstances that tested traditional assumptions about the relationship between inherited capability and family allegiance, while revealing how changing social conditions and educational opportunities could produce practitioners whose commitments and priorities operated according to principles that their ancestors would have found incomprehensible or unacceptable within their understanding of proper family loyalty and collective identity. The rejection of Zenin clan culture that Megumi demonstrated through his consistent refusal to embrace their hierarchical values and discriminatory practices represented more than personal preference or individual rebellion, embodying, instead, a fundamental critique of how inherited power could be corrupted through institutional structures that prioritize tradition over justice and family advancement over moral consideration for those whose capabilities or circumstances made them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse by established authorities. The influence that Megumi's example exercised over other young practitioners within and outside the Zenin family demonstrated how individual moral courage could inspire broader reconsideration of accepted practices and institutional relationships while providing alternative models for how inherited abilities could be understood and deployed in ways that served human welfare, rather than simply perpetuating systems of advantage and domination that benefited established interests at the expense of broader social progress and barely ethical development. The transformation of Maki Zenin from despised family member to formidable independent practitioner represents another form of generational challenge to traditional assumptions about the relationship between inherited technique and personal worth, demonstrating through her extraordinary development that individual determination and moral clarity could transcend the limitations and prejudices that family systems attempted to impose based on narrow definitions of acceptable capability and appropriate social roles for different categories of practitioners. Maki's systematic destruction of the Zenin clan structure represents the ultimate expression of how accumulated resentment over institutional injustice could motivate decisive action that eliminated sources of oppression while creating opportunities for entirely new approaches to organizing. Supernatural practitioners around principles of merit and moral consideration rather than inherited privilege and traditional authority that had been maintained through force and systematic exclusion of alternative perspectives and approaches. The symbolic significance of Maki's actions extended far beyond their immediate tactical consequences to represent broader questions about the legitimacy of inherited authority and the sustainability of systems that depended upon artificial scarcity and exclusion to maintain their relevance and influence within contexts where individual capability and moral commitment provided superior foundations for leadership and strategic decision-making than birthright and traditional procedure. The development of Noritoshi Kamo as a practitioner who embodied both technical mastery of his family's inherited abilities and explicit commitment to ethical application that rejected the corrupted legacy associated with his namesake, demonstrated how younger generations could reclaim and rehabilitate inherited techniques through conscious commitment to values and principles that transcended narrow family interests, while preserving the essential capabilities and strategic advantages that made such techniques valuable for addressing legitimate threats and challenges. The integration of modern strategic thinking with traditional technique mastery that characterized Noritoshi's approach to blood manipulation represented synthesis of inherited wisdom with contemporary moral philosophy that created possibilities for more effective and ethically grounded applications of family abilities, while avoiding the psychological corruption and institutional capture that had compromised previous generations' understanding of their proper role and responsibilities within broader social contexts. The collaborative relationships that developed among younger practitioners from different families reflected their shared commitment to values and objectives that transcended traditional competitive frameworks, while creating new models for how inherited abilities could be coordinated and mutually reinforced rather than deployed in opposition to each other, according to historical grievances and institutional rivalries that served no constructive purpose within contemporary strategic contexts. The question of whether traditional family structures could adapt to accommodate the changed perspectives and priorities of younger generations remained unresolved throughout the final period of conventional Jujutsu society, as institutional inertia and vested interests in existing arrangements created resistance to reforms that might have enabled peaceful evolution toward more inclusive and ethically grounded approaches to organizing supernatural practitioners around shared objectives rather than competitive advantage and hereditary privilege. The adoption practices that had brought individuals like Megumi into family structures without full integration into their cultural systems and value frameworks created additional sources of tension and opportunity for change, as these partially affiliated practitioners brought external perspectives and alternative approaches to understanding the relationship between individual capability and collective responsibility that challenged basic assumptions about loyalty, obligation, and proper priorities within family-based organizational systems. The chosen family relationships that developed among younger practitioners reflected their recognition that genuine mutual support and shared commitment to constructive objectives provided superior foundations for sustainable cooperation and effective strategic coordination than artificial bonds based solely on genetic inheritance or institutional assignment that ignored individual preferences, values, and moral commitments that shaped their understanding of purpose and meaning within their professional and personal lives. The technological and strategic innovations that younger practitioners developed through their collaborative approaches to problem solving demonstrated how diversity of perspective and technique could produce solutions and capabilities that exceeded what any single family tradition or inherited approach could achieve independently, validating arguments for more inclusive and cooperative organizational models while challenging traditional assumptions about the superiority of family-based knowledge preservation and technique development systems. The resistance that these innovations and alternative approaches encountered from established authorities reflected both genuine concerns about institutional stability and continuity and self-interested opposition to changes that might reduce the influence and privileges that traditional leaders had accumulated through their positions within hierarchical systems that prioritized inherited status over demonstrated competence and moral integrity as criteria for authority and decision-making responsibility. The mentorship relationships that developed between innovative educators like Gojo and younger practitioners created transmission mechanisms for alternative approaches to understanding power, responsibility, and the proper relationship between individual capability and social obligation that bypassed traditional family-centered knowledge systems while providing more comprehensive and ethically grounded preparation for the challenges and opportunities that characterized contemporary supernatural threats and strategic requirements. The ultimate potential that younger generations represented for transforming Jujutsu society into something more inclusive, effective, and morally grounded than the competitive and hierarchical systems that had characterized traditional family dominance remained largely unrealized due to the catastrophic disruptions and institutional collapse that marked the end of the conventional order, leaving questions about their capacity for constructive reform and innovation unresolved, but suggestive of possibilities for future development that transcended historical limitations and prejudices. The legacy that these younger practitioners established through their challenge to traditional assumptions and their demonstration of alternative approaches to wielding inherited power provides foundation for future developments that might realize the potential for supernatural capabilities to serve broader human welfare through organizational structures and value systems that prioritize effectiveness, inclusivity, and moral consideration over inherited privilege, competitive advantage, and traditional authority that had characterized the three great families throughout their millennium-long domination of Jujutsu society's political and strategic landscape. The systematic destruction of the traditional power structure that had governed Jujutsu society for over a millennium began not with external invasion or supernatural catastrophe, but with the internal contradictions and accumulated failures of institutions that had prioritized self-preservation over adaptation, competitive advantage over collective welfare, and inherited privilege over demonstrated competence in ways that created fundamental vulnerabilities to forces that understood how to exploit the very characteristics that these institutions believed made them strong and enduring. The fall of the three great families represents more than simple political transition or generational change, embodying instead the complete collapse of philosophical and organizational frameworks that had shaped human responses to supernatural threats since the earliest periods of recorded Jujutsu practice. When the necessity of coordinated defense against cursed spirits had created the first systematic approaches to managing individuals whose exceptional capabilities required specialized training, institutional support, and social structures that could harness their abilities for collective benefit rather than personal advancement. The Zenin clan's destruction at Maki's hands represents perhaps the most dramatic and symbolically significant expression of how accumulated injustice and institutional corruption could ultimately generate forces that proved capable of eliminating the very systems that had created and perpetuated such problems through their commitment to traditional practices and hierarchical relationships that prioritized inherited status over individual merit and family loyalty over moral consideration for those whose circumstances made them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The methodical nature of Maki's assault upon her family structure reflected not mindless rage or personal vendetta, but calculated elimination of individuals and systems that had demonstrated through their actions and choices that they were incapable of reform or adaptation sufficient to address the fundamental contradictions between their stated objectives of protection and service and their actual practices of discrimination and oppression that served narrow interests at the expense of broader human welfare and institutional effectiveness. The ease with which a single, determined individual could annihilate an entire clan structure that had maintained dominance over Jujutsu society for centuries revealed the profound weakness that lay beneath appearances of strength and stability, demonstrating how institutions that depended upon artificial constraints and systematic exclusion to maintain their authority could be overwhelmed by practitioners whose capabilities and commitment transcended the limitations that such systems attempted to impose through traditional training, methods, and social conditioning. The symbolic significance of Maki's transformation from powerless outcast to unstoppable force of institutional destruction represented broader themes about individual potential and the relationship between personal worth and inherited capability that had implications extending far beyond immediate tactical consequences toward fundamental questions about how supernatural abilities should be understood, developed, and deployed within social structures that claim to serve human welfare while perpetuating systems of advantage and discrimination. The massacre that eliminated the higher-ups and administrative leadership of Jujutsu headquarters demonstrated how completely the traditional governance system had become dependent upon secrecy, isolation, and the passive acceptance of those they claimed to govern while failing to develop the kind of genuine legitimacy and institutional effectiveness that might have provided protection against challenges to their authority from practitioners who possessed both superior capabilities and moral clarity about the failures and contradictions that characterized existing arrangements. The participation of students like Yuta Okotsu and Toge Inumaki in the systematic elimination of institutional leadership reflected the complete breakdown of traditional relationships between educators and administrators, practitioners and authorities, that had been strained beyond sustainability by the accumulated failures and moral compromises that had characterized official responses to successive crises and existential threats that demanded adaptation and innovation rather than bureaucratic procedure and political calculation. The speed and completeness with which these elimination operations were conducted revealed not only the exceptional capabilities of the practitioners who carried them out, but also the fundamental vulnerability of leadership structures that had become so disconnected from operational realities and practitioner concerns that they possessed neither effective defenses against internal threats nor sufficient legitimacy to inspire protection from those who might otherwise have been willing to preserve existing institutions despite their obvious flaws and limitations. The absence of meaningful resistance or attempted defense of traditional authorities during these systematic eliminations demonstrated how thoroughly they had lost the confidence and loyalty of the very practitioners whose capabilities and commitment were essential for their protection and continued existence, creating circumstances where institutional collapse became inevitable once determined opponents decided to act upon accumulated grievances and moral objections to existing policies and practices. The role of Kenjaku in orchestrating and facilitating the destruction of traditional Jujutsu society through centuries of patient infiltration and manipulation represents the ultimate expression of how external enemies could weaponize internal contradictions and competitive instincts against Institutions that had become so focused on maintaining their positions relative to each other that they failed to recognize or prepare for threats that operated according to entirely different strategic frameworks and temporal perspectives. The infiltration of the Kamo family, through Kenjaku's possession of their ancestral head, created opportunities for systematic manipulation and internal sabotage that extended across generations while remaining invisible to security, measures, and oversight procedures that had been designed to address conventional threats, rather than sophisticated long-term strategies that exploited institutional assumptions and procedural limitations to achieve objectives that transcended normal categories of political competition and strategic rivalry. The creation of the cursed womb death paintings through Kenjaku's abuse of blood manipulation capabilities represented both the ultimate corruption of inherited techniques and demonstration of how family abilities could be perverted to serve objectives that contradicted everything the original developers had intended or would have considered acceptable within their understanding of proper applications and ethical limitations that should govern the use of such powerful and intimate forms of cursed energy manipulation. The orchestration of the culling game as a mechanism for transforming Jujutsu society from hierarchical institution into anarchic battlefield demonstrated how external manipulation could exploit existing tensions and competitive instincts to create circumstances where traditional approaches to governance and conflict resolution became impossible, while survival itself required abandoning established procedures and moral constraints that had previously limited acceptable responses to threats and challenges. The systematic elimination of experienced practitioners and institutional knowledge through the chaos and violence that characterized the culling game represented deliberate destruction of accumulated wisdom and capability that would have been necessary for reconstructing effective governance and strategic coordination following the collapse of traditional structures, ensuring that recovery and reorganization would be impossible even if individual survivors possessed the motivation and moral clarity necessary for such reconstruction efforts. The death of Satoru Gojo during his final confrontation with Sukuna marked not only the end of individual career and life, but also the symbolic conclusion of an era when overwhelming individual capability could provide sufficient protection and stability to compensate for institutional failures and systematic weaknesses that had been accumulating throughout the traditional order's final decades of increasing dysfunction and moral compromise under pressure from evolving threats and changing social conditions. The absence of adequate succession planning or institutional mechanisms for maintaining continuity following Gojo's death revealed how completely the existing system had become dependent upon singular capabilities and personal relationships rather than developing sustainable approaches to knowledge transmission, authority distribution, and strategic coordination that could survive leadership transitions and maintain effectiveness despite changes in personnel and circumstances that tested organizational resilience and adaptability. The philosophical implications of these systematic destructions extended beyond immediate tactical and political consequences toward fundamental questions about the nature of institutions and their relationship to the values and objectives they claim to serve, revealing how organizational structures could become obstacles to, rather than instruments for achieving the purposes that had originally justified their creation and continued existence within broader social contexts. The irony that the three great families and their associated institutions were ultimately destroyed, not by external enemies or supernatural catastrophes, but by the logical consequences of their own choices, policies, and institutional characteristics represents a form of poetic justice that demonstrates how accumulated failures and moral compromises could generate forces that proved capable of eliminating systems that had seemed permanent and unassailable to those who benefited from existing arrangements while remaining blind to their fundamental contradictions and vulnerabilities. The completeness of the institutional collapse that marked the end of traditional Jujutsu society reflected not temporary disruption or cyclical change, but fundamental transformation that eliminated the basic assumptions, relationships, and organizational frameworks that had defined how supernatural practitioners understood their roles, obligations, and proper relationship to broader human society for over a millennium of historical development and cultural evolution. The legacy of this systematic destruction encompasses both the obvious tragedy of lost knowledge, accumulated wisdom, and institutional capacity, and the less apparent but potentially more significant opportunity for entirely new approaches to organizing supernatural practitioners around principles and objectives that might prove more effective, inclusive, and morally grounded than the competitive hierarchical systems that had characterized the three great families throughout their domination of Jujutsu society's political and strategic landscape. The question of whether something better could emerge from the ashes of these destroyed institutions remained unresolved at the conclusion of traditional Jujutsu society's collapse. But the very completeness of that destruction created unprecedented opportunities for innovation and reform that might not have been possible within the constraints and limitations imposed by existing structures that had proven incapable of adaptation sufficient to address contemporary challenges and evolving requirements for effective supernatural threat management and practitioner development. And so we reach the twilight of the three great families, their ancient halls now silent, their power scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. The bloodlines that once commanded nations and shaped the very fabric of Jujutsu society have crumbled, not from external conquest, but from the weight of their own contradictions and the courage of those who refuse to accept inherited limitations. In their rise and fall, we see reflected the eternal human struggle between tradition and progress, between the safety of established order and the necessity of growth. Perhaps it is fitting that these families, born from an age of endless conflict, should meet their end in an era that demanded something better than perpetual war between inherited powers. As you drift towards sleep, let their story remind you that no dynasty lasts forever, that power built on birthright alone cannot withstand the tide of time, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the future is the courage to let old systems die so that new ones might flourish. Rest well, knowing that from endings come beginnings, and from the ashes of the old, something better might yet arise.